This Friday, you are welcome to the Cult of Scraton, a cult with spooky intentions and dark ritual. You can pick up your dark robes next to the dark knives. It's by the dark punch bowl. Yeah. Cults are a trope in media for a good reason. They provide conflict for the story, a group of antagonists with very strongly held beliefs and motivations, as well as a great deal of opportunities for world building in your stories. They are staples in fantasy fiction, but also in the horror and thriller genres. Many real-world cults, as well as their stories, are fascinating sources of nonfiction, and these groups are often infamous for how they manipulate and victimize the people who join them. However, because it's such a popular trope, you have a lot of people who tend to write it, and when you have a lot of people who tend to write it, that's when you tend to get a lot of people who suck at writing cults. But first, as your secular holy pope, I think we all need to praise today's sponsor, Manta Sleep Mask. Guys, I gotta say, when I was approached by Manta Sleep for this, I was a bit skeptical at first. I thought that sleep masks weren't really all that useful, and waking up tired was just a thing that's meant to happen as you grow older. When I say that this sleep mask worked instantly for me, and I became a fan overnight, I quite literally mean it. This is one of those products that simply works, and it works well. And they're willing to help you get better sleep with the code on screen to get 10% off. This sleep mask is an investment, not just in your own comfort, but also in your quality of life while you're awake. You won't know just how tired you were until you wake up feeling refreshed. Head on over to the link in the description and use my discount code to get 10% off at checkout. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. The first reason you might suck at writing cults is pretty simple. The leader is not a compelling, nuanced, or charismatic character. It can often be tempting for us as writers to make certain moral choices more obvious for the audience. But I think we need to employ the rule of treat your audience with a certain level of respect. You should trust your audience to know who's the bad guy in the situation. They don't always need to be a mustache-twirling villain who wants to convince everyone to eat. That's not to say we need every single cult leader to be some sort of tortured, sympathetic character with the charisma of a rock star. However, just like any other character, we need to think very carefully about who they are and why people follow them. A cult leader should have motivations, beliefs, and most important of all, flaws. These things should inform not just the character's actions, but also their words. How does the cult leader convince their followers to obey? How do they instill fear? Do they put on a kind or forgiving facade while they secretly send their other cult members to break down dissenters until they come crawling to them begging for help? All of these things can make for not just a compelling villain, but also a compelling cult leader. At the end of the day, a cult leader should be a leader. Perhaps they don't care too much about their underlings and are willing to sacrifice them on a whim. But how do they convince people to be sacrificed in such a way? Of course, cult leaders do not always need to be complex or deep characters in order to be well written. Sometimes they just need to serve a specific purpose in the story, and they need to serve it well. But they don't really need to do more than obstruct your protagonists with their evil actions. Which brings me to my next reason as to why you suck at writing cults. It's because your cult isn't really that much of an obstacle for your protagonists. Yes, a lot of the times it can be difficult to challenge our characters, as it often feels like an exercise of sadism to the things we come to love. It's very difficult to hurt our special and unique characters, but a cult is more than capable of that if we instead choose to fall in love with them too. And this is where I would advise that you learn to love your villains, and learn to become more of a bystander to your story rather than a doting parent. If something as organized and terrible as a cult is not properly challenging your protagonists in the story or providing a meaningful conflict to the narrative, I think you should question why that is. Is your cult perhaps not allowed to win in any meaningful way? Are their beliefs easily disproven? Are its members ultimately pathetic when they try to be threatening? This is not always a bad choice in fiction, by the way. Some stories work better when the villain is not overly threatening, or even in some ways pathetic or comedic. However, these choices should be made intentionally. And as a quick aside, I also want to talk about that little thing called intentions. Every now and then, a critic will overgeneralize a certain trope in fiction, plant their flag in the ground, and tell their audience that if something is not done in a certain specific type of way, then it's not well written. These can be things like emotionless characters, chapter 1s which drone on and on about the environmental details instead of moving the action forward, a non-threatening villain, a lack of a plot or character development, and maybe nonsensical world building or rapid tonal shifts. Until you realize that things like Free Rin, Lord of the Rings, children's shows, Seinfeld, Don Da Don, or JoJo's Bizarre Adventure exist. Because something I want to mention in this video when it comes to whether or not you make your cult a meaningful threat has less to do with a specific binary of a threatening cult being good and a non-threatening cult being bad, and more to do with whether or not the cult is coming off as you intended, and if that's actually enhancing your story or detracting from it. And before you start to feel uncomfortable or comfortable about the last critique you might have received for your story, I think it's also important to mention that it's obvious to writers when a choice made is intentional or not. As with many things in writing a story, one choice is inextricably linked to all other choices. It's a lot like making food. Sure, some people might not like beans or Brussels sprouts, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't include them if you yourself like beans or Brussels sprouts, or if you are trying to appeal to somebody who likes beans or Brussels sprouts. Beans go really well with rice, and the other goes really well with steaks. However, you wouldn't put beans in a bowl of milk with ketchup and mustard, and you wouldn't put Brussels sprouts on top of a hot fudge sundae. The choices you make as a writer and an artist must synergize. They must coalesce into a consistent and coherent story led by your vision and your intentions. For people who write a lot, it's very easy to see what's intentional and what's not. If you don't believe me, then pay me $10 and I'll tell you if I notice any inconsistencies in your work. Join my memberships, by the way. Anyways, in order to make the right choice about something like whether or not a cult should be threatening is to first establish who the story is made for. If it's for a more mature or aged audience, we might be more inclined to make a threatening cult than a non-threatening cult. However, we must also consider how we want our audiences to view the cult. Sometimes it's better to view something like a cult through the lens of satire and comedy. A cult might be less scary when we don't take it too seriously and instead decide to laugh at the absurd things people can come to believe and follow. But whether your cult is threatening or not, that doesn't really matter nearly as much as whether or not the cult is serving its narrative purpose in your story. That's not to say I don't have personal preferences, though. For me personally, I prefer a more threatening cult because it opens up a lot of roads which a non-threatening cult simply does not have. But related to this idea of authorial intent is also the idea of what the in-world intentions of a cult should be for your story. You see, cults are a great trope in fiction simply because of how easily they can provide conflict to any story. They are an organized group with a hierarchy at the top of which lies a charismatic villain. They might also happen to worship powerful evil entities, or engage in terrifying rituals to serve said powerful evil entities. Whatever it is that motivates the cult, we must provide a good set of intentions behind every action committed by this group. These actions will inform the plot and set your protagonists on a journey to either stop or witness their horrifying deeds. A cult is compelling because it's not just one evil villain and his schemes. It's not even just an evil group. It's an evil group filled with people who think they're right. It's a fervent group of zealots whose messiah has not yet died. A normal person may be convinced to warp themselves just to follow the rules and traditions of that cult. The leaders may exploit and abuse their underlings, and those underlings may be conditioned enough to thank them for it. More than anything, a cult is a belief system, and it's a community. Many cults in media tend to feel like a cult from the outside looking in. That is to say, it just looks like a bunch of random people in black robes and pajamas chanting around a salt circle for no reason at all. Maybe it's a random Satan worshiper or some sort of allegory for Satan worship. Either way, I think that those things tend to be a little bit more boring when compared to the actual psychology behind something like a cult. Cults are not fringe ideologies which only extremists or stupid people get swept up in. There are normal, everyday people who can become part of cults. And in order to write better cults in your stories, I think it would do everybody watching a lot of good to understand the psychology of cults and cultish recruitment. The way cult behaviors form, and how the leader is both the unquestionable messiah and a hopelessly trapped victim of the monster they've created. There are plenty of YouTube documentaries out there about cults, and I would recommend watching a few of them if you ever wanted some inspiration for your next story. Regardless, some basic things to understand about cult psychology is that cults usually target vulnerable people, or rather, normal people in vulnerable moments in their lives. Not just people who are poor, emotionally unstable, or physically inept. No, they target people who feel alone. People who are angry and don't know where to put that anger. People who are confused and lost and who need a simple explanation for everything and something to believe in. Cults prey upon people like this, and these people are not all idiots. In fact, not all of these people are inherently evil either. It can provide a lot of nuance to your story to remember this when writing a cult in your fiction. At the end of the day, a cult is made of people, and people have their own individual reasons for joining that cult. Most people don't recognize that they're in a cult until it's too late to get out of it. Because another reason you might suck at writing cults is simply because you're not depicting the trap that they truly are. It can be bone-chilling to watch all the people you have befriended, the people you love, the people you look up to and respect, all turn on you because one person told them you are not faithful enough. Cults will isolate their members who show any level of dissent. They will wield social currency over their victims. It's not just that you're not faithful enough, it's that you cannot leave because no one is allowed to leave. No one is allowed to disgrace the Messiah by losing faith in them. It is often the most dangerous time for most ex-cultists, not when they are in the cult, but when they are trying to get out of it, when they are trying to change their minds. People who might express their lack of faith to those they think they can trust, only to be betrayed. Sometimes people even try to convince other members to leave with them. Sometimes the one who wants to escape that cult is the one who created it all in the first place. And if that revelation doesn't at least inspire a couple of ideas in your head for an interesting story, then I don't really know what will. The life lesson here is that not every cult is centered around the spiritual or esoteric. Some cults are not really considered cults at all, but they take a lot from the psychology of a cult. Gangs, shadowy organizations, even a group your protagonist might come to befriend or rely upon. Heck, you might have even been a part of a group or two with certain cult-like behaviors, centered around one charismatic person who you might seek the attention and admiration of, someone like a YouTuber you'd join the Discord of to get close to them in order to be involved in the community. Completely unrelated to cults, by the way, I have a public Discord now. I've had it for a while, and I keep forgetting to talk about it and advertise it. And, right now seems like a very brand safe time for me to do that. So, links in description if you want to check it out. Or don't. I don't really want to be your cult leader, honestly. But you can post your writing and get feedback on it over there. So, yeah. Back on topic, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to cults is what a good opportunity they are for world building. Not all cults may follow a religion, but they do have a system of beliefs. Those beliefs are going to be spurred from somewhere. Everything is connected. One reason you might suck at writing cults is simply because you've failed to connect it to the rest of your world in a proper way. Perhaps you've settled on it being a bog standard satanic cult, or perhaps some kind of weird blood ritual dark wizardry shit. That's all well and good in some stories, but if you really want to take it to the next level, then you're going to be thinking about why such a religion was invented in the first place. What does it explain? What does it offer that other religions and groups may not in your world? Perhaps it points out a grand conspiracy or truth about the world. Perhaps the thing the cult worships will grant powers to their faithful. Perhaps there is a lore tied between the gods of your world and the gods worshipped by the cult. Or perhaps there is a lore of the cult's founding and why it exists in the first place. Regardless of what these things are, your cult should have a history, and they should draw upon the themes of your story. What can a cult say about your protagonists? What can it say about your story and the world that you set it in? What role does the cult fulfill for the people who join it? Most importantly, how can the protagonists potentially fill that void instead? How can they overcome the fervent worship of these cultists and perhaps even rescue them or help them escape? Perhaps not every cultist is a stranger to the protagonist. Perhaps the protagonist knows somebody who is a part of the cult and wants to help them leave. Or perhaps they themselves are in the cult. And perhaps some more questions to ask are things like, was there a world event which perhaps left people vulnerable to recruitment by this cult? What's the purpose of the cult in the grand scheme of things? And most importantly, what is the truth about the cult's beliefs? Is there some kernel of truth hidden within a mountain of well-told and well-constructed lies? Or does the cult maybe have a point? Not all cults necessarily need to be bad, after all. But at the end of the day, that is yet another decision among many in your story. And just like our stories in life, we have to make a great deal of decisions. Some smaller than others, some more difficult than others. But in this moment, I advise all of you still watching to make the right decision. Take your revelations, open up a document, and start writing.